Welcome back, Daisy Cakes! Today we're going to look at Too Many Magicians by Randall Garrett, which was a nominee for the 1967 Hugo Awards. Why? Because I am Daisy Ex Machina, the drag queen detective who investigates all things speculative in science fiction, fantasy, and horror. I picked Too Many Magicians by Randall Garrett as part of my series where I look for books to add to my TBR from the nominees of the Hugo and Nebula Awards. This is the second time I've picked a book by Randall Garrett. The first time was when he co-authored a novel called That Little Old Lady with Lawrence M. Jennifer under the pen name of Mark Phillips, which was a combination of their middle names. My review of That Little Old Lady, also known as Brain Twister, also has a short biography of Randall Garrett, if you're interested, which you can watch up here. I've also talked about Randall Garrett when he wrote really bad puns inspired by Spider-Man Fake Hoot called Benedict Breadfruit. But That Little Old Lady and Benedict Breadfruit were humorous stories, and Randall Garrett's Too Many Magicians is not. It features a detective named Lord Darcy. And I tried to figure out what type of subgenre are these Lord Darcy stories. I looked and looked, and I finally found the subgenre. It's a subgenre called occult detective. Now, I had never heard of this occult detective subgenre, and there's a good reason why, because it is not a subgenre of fantasy or any speculative fiction. It is a subgenre of detective fiction. So what is occult detective fiction? I think it's pretty obvious from the name. It is about a detective who investigates the occult, which is an old-fashioned name for magic. Arguably, the first occult detective was found in short stories about a character named Harry Escott, who's a specialist in the supernatural and investigated ghosts. These stories were written by Fitz James O'Brien in the 1850s. O'Brien was an American author who published quite a few short stories and poems during his very young life because at the age of 35, he passed away while serving the Union Army during the Civil War. What may be the first iconic occult detective was created by English author William Hope Hodgson in his detective Thomas Carnacki, who appeared in a series of short stories published between 1910 and 1912, which was modeled after none other than Sherlock Holmes. The term occult literally means hidden and refers to the hidden or secret sciences like astrology and numerology, tarot, ceremonial magic, which was very prominent in the early 20th century and also went by the names of Spiritism, Theosophy, Hermeticism, and on and on. There were several prominent occultists during that time, like you may have heard of Helena Blavatsky, or the so-called most evil man in the world, Aleister Crowley. Well, guess what? Some of these occultists also wrote occult detective fiction, including Aleister Crowley, who wrote a series of short stories starring the detective Simon If, who was basically an idealized version of Crowley himself. Another occultist is Dion Fortune, who wrote what I think is one of the best books on the Kabbalah, called The Mystical Kabbalah. She also wrote short stories featuring the occult detective Dr. Taverner. Occult detective fiction keeps popping up throughout the 20th century, from Robert E. Howard, Steve Harrison, to Mercedes Lackey's Diana Treguard. For myself, I started reading the comic Hellblazer when it first came out in 1988 about the chain-smoking occult detective John Constantine, who first appeared earlier in another of my favorite comics at that time, Swamp Thing, by an author you may have heard of, Alan Moore. If nothing else, you may be familiar with the movie adaptation Constantine, starring Keanu Reeves. And of course, any modern fantasy reader has at least heard of Jim Butcher's The Dresden Files. One of my favorite speculative novel series of recent years are murder mysteries that feature what I guess has become an iconic detective duo, Din and Anna. The first novel is The Tainted Cup. It's by Robert Jackson Bennett, and it won the Hugo in 2025 and is a must read. If you haven't read it, go out and pick up a copy. It's that good. It is set in a very fantastical other world, so I'm not sure if it strictly counts in the occult detective subgenre, which I believe usually is set in a version of our world, but I think we should be able to stretch that definition to include it. But let's get back to Too Many Magicians by Randall Garrett. I went ahead and got a hard copy of this omnibus of all the Randall Garrett Lord Darcy stories. The book is called Lord Darcy. It includes 3 books, Murder and Magic, Too Many Magicians, and Lord Darcy Investigates. The first and second books, Murder and Magic and Lord Darcy Investigates, are anthologies of short stories. Too Many Magicians is the only full-length novel that Randall Garrett wrote of Lord Darcy. I haven't completely finished reading all the short stories in the anthologies, but I have read stories out of each one, which includes the very first short story, The Eyes Have It, spelled E-Y-E, Eyes Have It, not I as in A-Y-E. Did I mention that Randall Garrett likes puns? The Eyes Have It introduces us to Lord Darcy and his sidekick or co-investigator, the sorcerer Sean O'Loughlin. Lord Darcy himself has no magical powers. He relies on the sorcerer Sean O'Loughlin. By the way, all of these can be read out of order. All the stories are standalones. In fact, the last story in the first book, Murder and Magic, was published after Too Many Magicians, which is considered the second book. There may be references to prior investigations, like I'll remember the case of the so-and-so, but there's no reason to read these in order. Also, while I was researching the first book, Murder and Magic, I remember the cover art from the late 70s, early 80s, because it was so cool. This hand making a gesture with symbols and fire. Now, I never got the book, probably because it was an anthology and I was more into full-length novels, but that cover was so memorable. Anyway, the first thing that threw me about Lord Darcy was the setting because of the name Lord Darcy and this cover art and the blurbs. I thought it was set in a Sherlock Holmes Victorian era. Even when you say Lord Darcy, you think of Darcy from Pride and Prejudice, which was, I guess, more Regency. But still, look at this cover. It doesn't look modern or contemporary, but it actually is. These stories are set in the time period when they were published, that is the 60s and 70s. But when you read it, there is this distinct lack of technology. It seems like the world is stuck in the 1920s with gas lamps and horse-drawn carriages, but the more you read, the more you come to realize that since magic exists in this world and exists in a big way, scientists only study magic, not technology. So there was no industrial revolution. Not only that, the more you read, the more you realize how much of an alternate history this is. Yes, the setting is 1960s, but it is this British-French state ruled by the Plantagenets, not the Windsors. Apparently, the Plantagenets can trace the roots to King Arthur and are still in power. Their nemesis is the evil kingdom of Poland, who rules Eastern Europe. There's no mention of Russia, and there's no mention of the United States because it never came into existence. That land is still ruled by the indigenous people there. We see one Lord Quetzal, which I guess is from Quetzalcoatl, who is visiting from the kingdom of Mexico. For me, in my mind, I was constantly having to update the world or the world building, which I found sometimes annoying, but sometimes it was kind of cool. The other thing that you have to get used to is that Garrett, at least in these Lord Darcy stories, was a bit of an Anglophile and romanticized the class system of royalty and titles. Also, the church is romanticized in that the church controls magic. All priests are healers or adept at healing, and in order to practice sorcery, you need a license from the church because black magic must be prevented at all costs. It makes for a very neat and organized world of black and white. I don't see any shades of gray, at least from what I've read so far. The other thing that may surprise you is the actual mysteries themselves are mundane. They may tangentially be related to magic or involve magic, but the solution, at least from what I've read so far, is always solved through logic and deduction. And if you removed all the magic or supernatural trappings, the solution would still make sense. Too Many Magicians is a locked room murder mystery, meaning that there was a body found in a room where no one could have gone in or out of, but a murder obviously took place. In this case, the victim was a sorcerer during a sorcerer's convention, thus Too Many Magicians, all of whom are suspects. And when there are so many magicians or sorcerers involved, you are led down this garden path that maybe the solution is because of magic, but it's not. There's also a seemingly unrelated murder far away. Spoiler, it's not really unrelated. We also get introduced to Lord Darcy's cousin, the equally brilliant detective, the obese Marquis of London, who is apparently modeled after Nero Wolfe, the obese detective created by Rex Stout, who was my father's favorite detective. So I ended up reading quite a few Nero Wolfe novels simply because there are so many lying around the house. Anyway, the Marquis of London is too lazy to solve the locked room murder, even though it's in his jurisdiction. So he manipulates events. So Lord Darcy is called in to solve the mystery. Darcy gets a little bit of revenge on his cousin as he goes about solving the mystery with the help of course, investigator sorcerer Sean O'Loughlin, and also the Marquis of London's assistant, special investigator Lord Bontriumph, who is the Marquis' Archie Goodwin, if you know who that is. I think these stories are delightful. They're written straight up in the style of Arthur Conan Doyle, which also makes the writing feel dated, which is why I kept thinking this was Victorian. I will tell you truthfully, I think I enjoyed the short stories more than the full-length novel, Too Many Magicians. I mean, I still recommend Too Many Magicians, especially if you like traditional mysteries with iconic detectives like Nero Wolfe or Miss Marple or Sherlock Holmes or Jessica Fletcher. I think you'll really like Too Many Magicians, especially if a locked room murder mystery appeals to you. I just personally enjoyed the short stories where I could just sit down and read an entire one in one sitting. That's why I'll keep this book on my nightstand for whenever I feel like reading a short story. And by the way, if you want more Lord Darcy, it didn't end with those 3 volumes by Randall Garrett. Garrett's friend and fellow writer Michael Kurland continued the stories after Garrett's death. He wrote 2 more full-length Lord Darcy novels, 10 Little Wizards, obviously after the Agatha Christie novel, and A Study in Sorcery, obviously after the Arthur Conan Doyle novel, A Study in Scarlet. And I'm kind of interested in those novels as well. But what about you? Have you read or do you want to read any of the Lord Darcy stories by Randall Garrett? Let me know down in the comments. And while you're there, don't forget to like this video and subscribe to my channel. And keep an eye out when I pick a book from the 1968 Hugo nominees. Until we meet again, may all the books you read be blessed.